Hello there and welcome Virtual Space Hero community to another Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live. Today we are talking about one of the fundamentals that we already discussed in some of our previous conversations here with global remote experts from across the globe. We are talking about why communication is quintessential for remote work. And we will be having a focus today on asynchronous communication. And this already leads me to usually saying hello and giving the floor and the stage to one of my guests. Unfortunately, Carlos Silva, who was supposed to be with me here on the show today, is not able to join. Carlos, really don't worry. I hope to bring you on the show very soon again, and we will definitely find, or we will talk about the same topic or find another topic that you're passionate about. Carlos is one of the thought leaders, remote experts that you definitely should follow on LinkedIn. Having said that, today, as you can see, I'm solo on the stage, and I will be doing a session and share with you my thoughts on asynchronous work and asynchronous communication and why this is important for virtual organizations, but also for hybrid work. But I would love to know if any one of you is interested in joining me here on the stage. If you are, drop a note in LinkedIn or on Facebook, whatever channel you're joining from, and I'll make sure to forward you immediately the StreamYard link so that you out there, audience, you will be my guest on the show. So don't be timid, don't be shy. If you want to share anything about asynchronous communication or your thoughts on communication in virtual and hybrid teams, drop a note in the event itself, and I'll make sure to share the StreamYard link with you. So I'm really curious if this is going to be worked out, because clearly this is also an experiment. So we will see if somebody takes the call for guests, the call for speakers in this case. So at the end today, we are discussing one of the fundamentals of hybrid and virtual work. We're talking about communication. And it's really interesting because if I think about also how my workshops around virtual work or global virtual teamwork or hybrid work evolved over the past years, definitely communication became more and more a fundamental part of it. And why is that? Because one thing that we did learn from the pandemic is, and it was a very strong Twitter post out there, it was not about going fully remote, but that already provided many, many advantages for employees of companies who didn't offer that possibility before. But what really brought a lot of benefits is going fully or partly, but highly partly asynchronous. And why is that? So when I talk with my managers that are in my coaching program, or when I talk with the organizations, the HR managers, and I try to sort of convey the message that for a deep work, we cannot be interrupted all the time. And that's also why, among the reasons, why in virtual organizations or in hybrid work, we should have a strong focus on asynchronous communication. I very often get those faces like, what? Are you really sure? I cannot believe that. Well, that is very often the point, because what we do see is that we believe as human beings that it is the best if we are meeting, and we have the best conversations if we are meeting real time. But that is not really true. So I see here also Rigoberto Vasquez is joining the conversation. Rigoberto, if you're interested, drop me a note. I want to join, and you'll be on the stage. He's talking about communication loss. I hope not the communication here between us is lost, but that you lose the communication maybe in your team to some extent if you are too much connected or too less connected. So asynchronous communication, and why is it so important? First of all, let us distinguish between synchronous and asynchronous communication. Synchronous communication at the end is what we are having all the time when we are in a meeting, for example, in a video meeting, in a conference call, or even if we are in a real-time chat where it is expected to answer immediately at the same time. This, of course, means being in a meeting. We do know that 50% of the time of managers usually are spent in meetings. So we already know that there is little time for focused work or, for example, leadership work. When we think about asynchronous communication and why it is so important, we talk about a way of communicating with each other that is very simple. We're doing it all the time when we send messages or when we leave voicemails or when we record videos. And async communication just means that those who are receiving your messages are not likely to be in the same space or in the same time. So you are not getting an immediate response. When you do async communication, we already heard that there are different channels that we could even use. The traditional channel would be, for example, an email. When we send an email, usually we do not expect an immediate response, although this is very often happening in some organizations. But the idea behind sending async communication, async messages to your team members would be exactly that they can respond when it is best for them. When it is best for them, meaning when they have the time, when they don't have sort of to leave behind them a certain work that they are currently doing, but they respond when they finish that and when they can think and have enough time to dive into the topic or whatever you're sending through. When we do async communications, we need to think also about the best format. What is really the best format and the best communication channel? So there are several questions that we need to ask ourselves. On one hand, we can have written messages, we can have verbal messages, but we could also have video messages. Each of them clearly has advantages or disadvantages. And even then, I can still think about where do I send those messages? And nowadays we are flooded and we have really a lot of tools that provide us with the possibility to easily send written, verbal, or video messages. But we need to be aware that maybe not always a written message is the best way to go. Maybe not always the video message is the best to go or the verbal message. So being intentional in our communication and even in async communication, being intentional of what medium we're choosing is very important. And then, of course, we also have the channel, because very often in organizations that I work with, I do have different channels that are being used for async communications. Very often we do have in organizations still the email in place. Very often we do have Slack or Microsoft Teams or any other kind of tool that provides like a channel-based structure for communication. Very often we do even have WhatsApp within a team that is another communication channel. What is important, of course, and that's already something that you're figuring out, is if we have a lot of different communication channels in place, we need to be intentional and clear on what channel we are using for what kind of messages, for what kind of target groups or recipients of the message, and even being intentional and clear about what response time are we expecting from each other on the different channels, because that can also change. And even though I try in most of the teams that I'm working with, we're already getting away from email messages as an async communication tool. We are mainly using messaging tools, communication tools such as Slack, with a structure based on channels, or Microsoft Teams, for example, where you also have a very similar way of communicating. I do know teams that afterwards still use Confluence or any other tool who help themselves structure the communication and document it even better. But the point of thinking using a different channel, namely Microsoft Teams or Slack channels, where more people have access to the communication thread, would be also that you already have a better documentation of what you are discussing. Think about an email. I'm writing an email to my assistant, to my team member, to my colleague. This is always one-on-one. But if I'm writing that message, targeting and tagging somebody, for example, in a Slack channel, then it is much, much clearer and much, much easier also to follow the conversation for other team members. So when we talk about documentation and most of the companies that are remote first or async first, they already have a very, very strong documentation culture. But the documentation culture is important. We talk about that in a bit. So how does async communication work? We already talked about thinking about the right format for the message that you're delivering. By that, you also need to think about if the person receiving the message really has all the context. Do you need to tag in, for example, another conversation thread that refers to a certain argument that you are making? And this, of course, within a channel-based communication structure is much, much easier than if we were talking about an email. So context and giving context is very important. Besides that, when we talk about asynchronous communication and relying mainly, let's say, written communication, we also do know that the way we are writing, we need to definitely improve that. What I do see in teams that go asynchronous and try to be more asynchronous, maybe not fully async, but try to be more asynchronous nowadays, they also start working on their written communication skills, but also on their verbal ones in case you use, for example, videos. Think about it that way, or think about previous emails that you got today. Were there emails or messages that didn't have a proper subject line, that were confused and are having many different arguments in one message where they don't relate to each other, for example? Think about it if you have a very long message, for example, and you need to structure that message in a different way, because we do know that in written communication, we are challenged with the fact that people are not reading, or maybe also listening or watching critical information. So we need to be very intentional even about the way that we structure a message that we are sending through whatever or with whatever format it is. Many organizations, I was just recently involved in a project that was hugely interesting because we were redesigning the recruitment and onboarding process for a global organization, now recruiting more globally, and therefore also having more global teams, meaning not in the same time zone. So also meeting synchronously in video meetings, for example, or any other kind of meetings is more difficult. And in those teams, for example, what we added as one of the aspects or one of the skills that we are requesting and looking for when recruiting new team members, we added the written communication skills, async communication skills in a broader way. And I do know that many organizations have that already before. Written communication skills are important, or communication skills. But did they really look for that and set their process up to make sure and think about how to become aware if an applicant for a position really has the necessary async communication skills? Not really. So this is something that I see as a trend on the market. And also when I talk to other headhunters or recruiters, they are telling me that they face exactly that challenge, that they are sometimes struggling to find people that are also great communicators. And we need to be great hybrid or async communicators when we talk about hybrid work, async communication and async writing skills. So we do know that people overread critical information. That is why we need to be such good communicators. But we also need to be aware, for example, that people usually tend to write messages more critically and also receive them and interpret them more negatively. So that is also why sometimes I have the feeling, I have no data on that yet, but I have the feeling if I look at the teams that I work with, that at the beginning, they might be struggling more. And that is when they say, well, you see, it's exactly, we need more meetings because we don't have enough meetings. And that's why people are getting lost. But usually this is not really true nor the case, because we do know that the moment that I have a clear communication policy and clear communication team norms on what, where, when, and how, it becomes so transparent that teams just start to work much, much better together. When we talk about asynchronous communication, there is also the possibility, of course, and that's also sometimes easier, as I was already referring to before, if we need to tag in to the message that we're sending another conversation that had been done on the subject, we can just tag that into our communication structure. And I find that tremendously helpful when we talk about efficient communication. As I said, we cannot really tag an email, or it's just we can add the email as an attachment, but still that is pretty different to what we're discussing here now. What else do we need to keep in mind when we talk about asynchronous communication and how to implement asynchronous communication workflows, for example? We do know that asynchronous communication can even alleviate stress and support mental health in your team. So that is one of the big benefits. It allows for more diversity. This is an argument that often I do see leaders not really understanding that, or sometimes also disagreeing with me on the topic. But think about it this way: the moment that we allow for asynchronous communication in our job, we usually take pressure out of our team members, of the shoulders of our team members. Why? Because it's not necessary that they instantly put down the pencil or take away the keyboard or sort of close whatever they were working on and immediately answer, which interrupts them in one activity. So deep work is gone, which also very often I do hear from my coaching clients or the managers I work with and their teams, that sometimes they have the feeling it produces even more errors. Why? Because I'm constantly switching in between different activities, tasks, even projects. And that, of course, creates stress and burden on my shoulders. That is why asynchronous communication allows for less stressful work environments, in my experience. As I said before, the moment that we go more async, very often I feel like that there is a curve sort of happening where people are like, okay, async, cool. But at some point it's like, no, we need to have more meetings because we're losing connection. But I don't really think it is about losing the connection, but very often it is still our mindset. That's what I hear when I'm doing my workshops or my trainings or my coachings. Sometimes we have that mindset that only great communication or great connection can be achieved if we meet sort of daily or something, which is definitely not true. And that is also why relying on async communication, you still can have a fantastic culture within your team. You still can have a lot of trust in your team, but only if it's done right and if you think about the different aspects that we're discussing here in this live stream. Again, a call for guests on the live stream. I don't see yet if anybody wants to join me. So all those out there who see the live stream and would like to share their experiences, I'd be super happy to write you a private message with the link to the platform that I'm using for streaming, and you'll be on stage immediately, okay? Fantastic. We talk about asynchronous communication again and alleviating for stress. Something else that I see, and also studies show, of course, as a previous researcher, I look a lot at data and how I can argue also with data to allow for more asynchronous communication in organizations. We do know that asynchronous communication usually, if done well and with intentionality, is perceived much more productive. And this is something that, of course, we cannot argue is super important in our organizations. So when we talk about how to do that, and this is now really a different topic, when we talk about how to move from a rather synchronous communication culture towards a rather asynchronous communication culture in our organization, we need to be aware that this can take time. So I recall one organization that I joined around 10 years ago, and I think we started using Slack as our communication channel more or less 5 years ago. And I do still know that in some teams, we have to additionally even send out emails because not everybody is yet onboarded perfectly to the platform. This is not about the new team members, because it's pretty easy to onboard a new team member to an existing culture or an existing communication system because they are being onboarded with the tools that we are having in place. But sometimes the change from one system like emails to a channel-based structure can be a daunting one. It can just take time. So we also need to bring a lot of patience with us. We also need to be aware that we need to aim, and I think this is a little bit what very often I hear in remote work discussions, we need to aim for progress and not perfection. So of course, from one day to another, not everybody will be able to switch, and it will not be the perfect progress, the perfect communication change project, for example, but we're making progress day by day, and this is very important. Asynchronous communication, and we discussed that previously. I mentioned it in one of my previous arguments. Asynchronous communication is very much based on documentation, because clearly, if I don't have my documentation right in place, it's difficult to work asynchronously, right? Because if I don't have all the things that I need for my work to be looked for, I can look them up, I do need to call all the time people, right? Because sometimes I need it to work with. I remember one of the conversations I had last year in an Austrian HR manager conference, and I already mentioned that a few times in on different stages where I was invited as a speaker, because I find it really it shows a lot why sometimes hybrid or virtual work is not working that well. There was that HR manager, and he told me, well, Barbara, I think the virtual work is really not working with the hybrid work. You know why? Because I have the feeling that the virtual workers, they take advantage of the on-site workers. And I was like, how can that be possible? How is that working? Why do they take advantage of them? And he told me, well, you know how often I do see my on-site workers, those who are in the office, running around with the cell phone and looking up folders or documents that the virtual workers need. And sometimes they have to scan it, send it to them. Sometimes they have to read it out because it was a meeting minute or whatsoever that is here in a folder. And so I see that, I feel like my on-site workers, sometimes they are like puppets in our organization. So imagine that. All of you out there, what is the problem here? So let's see if I'm getting a few ideas on what the general problem here, of course, is. I'm just giving you a few seconds also to think about that. I, of course, continued talking with that HR manager, and by the end of the day, I think that at least there was a small understanding, or a small increase of understanding why the on-site workers are not puppets, but rather the documentation and the barrier-free access to the documentation is not yet in place. We do know that documentation and access from anywhere at the end is something that needs to be granted if I want to rely on asynchronous communication. And that is also why we need to think about the right tools. So what tools are you using in your organization when it comes to documentation? And there are many different tools probably out there that you're using. And we just need to be also very intentional about how we do that. Asynchronous communication goes hand in hand with documentation. And I'm coming back now to one of the arguments that I made at the very beginning. I do believe that when we talk about asynchronous communication and teams working together in a virtual or hybrid context, we need to rely on low context communication. Low context communication means very precise, very clear, and very transparent. This refers to, on one hand, on the writing style, of course, and on the way we're communicating, but it also refers to what I mentioned previously, having a very clear team charter, team rules, team guidelines about communication in place in order to make it clear when to communicate, what to communicate, through what channel, and maybe even the preferred format, depending on the team that you're working with. So team charters or team guidelines about communication are really important when it comes to hybrid work. We can even think about asynchronous meetings, but this is something that we are probably going to pick up maybe with Carlos at another point in time on this virtual space here, LinkedIn live stream. We already have, and this is also just to invite you to check out our webpage on virtualspacehero.com. You already can find all the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn live guests lined up until December this year. So you know that our live stream is always happening on Thursdays, 5:30, and it lasts around 35, max 40 minutes, which also already brings me to, whoa, we are here almost at the end by now of our today's questions about asynchronous communication. So and I'm picking up now on one of the questions that reached me before the live stream. So when should you use asynchronous communication, and when is it important to maybe use synchronous communication? Usually the experience of the teams and also some of the studies or articles that I read suggest that if you have very complex matters that need a lot of real-time interaction, if you're having a difficult situation where there was a communication misunderstanding or even a conflict arose, those would be the moments when I would say, okay, this might be really better to be handled in a synchronous meeting, in a synchronous way, whatever tool you're using. But even then, there of course are arguments why even a conflict might be resolved better if you're using asynchronous communication. But this depends on the team. But be aware that also the choice between asynchronous and synchronous communication must be an intentional one. But the default, let's have a meeting, is not the way forward. The way forward is to be intentional about when we choose having a meeting. And very often, you probably know that it's a colleague popping by the office if we're on site. It is a colleague calling you in a way that like 5 times one after the other, so that you need to pick up because it seems like that the house is burning. And very often it's like, can I disturb you for like 3 minutes? Can I pick your brain in 3 minutes? And often that is already half an hour at the end of the conversation. Sometimes that might be okay and that might be great, but if it's just too much and we always by default go that way, let's have a meeting for whatever, it's just not productive. And one thing that we did learn out of the pandemic is that most of us, if there are real remote first and hybrid working conditions back home, we're not talking about the pandemic, because in the pandemic, we do know that having kids homeschooling, having our dog, maybe elderly that I have to take care of in my household, that's not a great home office environment. But if I have my home office set up in such a way, and my kids are at school, for example, or we're in the kindergarten, wheresoever, then I am usually able to be more productive and more effective when I'm working from the place that I choose to work from. you know that I am very traditional, or I am very, I don't know, or very boring maybe for all of those out there who like to work from the beach or from the mountain or from the woods. I do prefer having my really great home office setup that I have here in Spain or in Austria, where I have a great task, a stable Wi-Fi connection and a cable connection as well. I do have my standing desk, but that helps me to be super productive. And also I have the luxury to have my own office, to be fair. So many of us who cannot, for example, have their home office set up in such a way, and they don't have a quiet space where they can really focus on their work, they also prefer to go sometimes to the office. And that is great. And this is also why I do not have the feeling that the future of work is all remote. The future of work is choice. And this is something that I learned from Lisette Sutherland that I tremendously admire. The future of work is choice. It is not all remote for everybody. And this is something we need to take in mind, definitely. At the end today now, before we sort of finish our today's LinkedIn Live, I want to pick up on a few ideas that I just recently read about what you can do to foster that asynchronous working culture. So one thing is, you have usually whatever instant messaging system you're using, you have the possibility to set your status. And setting your status by having it deep work will be slow to respond, for example, already shows your colleagues and team members that even though it's an instant messaging tool, and very often we do use also Slack or Microsoft Teams as instant messaging tools, you're using it in an asynchronous fashion. And this is important. I do know colleagues, and I just recently, I think in October or November, I saw it with a colleague. I also implemented it in my own email signature that I'm still having with some of my clients. I did implement an email signature that also sort of is a pro async email signature, using at the signature at the bottom, or over my signature, even a PS, my work hours may not be your work hours. Please don't feel obliged to respond outside your normal schedule. Or when you feel that you have all the information and the time and the mind free to really respond for it. There is another third practice that very often we discuss in my workshop. It's about scheduling your messages. This is something that only works, of course, if you're working the same time zone. The moment that you're working with a global virtual team, very often you are working in different time zones. So anyways, if I'm sending the message in the normal working hours, whatever they are in my organization, it might reach you outside of your normal working hours. But sometimes we can even think about or consider scheduling the messages. So if I have a tremendous thought of I'm working at a very unusual time, and I do have still the feeling that in my organization I might put pressure on my team colleagues. If I'm sending the email at 3 a.m. in the morning, I might just schedule that for later, and therefore also take off that pressure to see when that email was written. This, of course, is something that for teams who have a long history in working remotely or in async communication might not be necessary, just because we do know that we are working when it best fits our situation, when my brain works best, or when I could work best that day, because that's the idea and that's the beauty. Sometimes due to my async communication style, I'm just able to take off the morning because I do know the hat is not burning anywhere or nothing can reach me that requires immediate attention, and I can go to the playground that is not as crowded as in the afternoon, in the mornings. And that is the beauty, because it gives me the possibility to work maybe later on that day, that same day, and respond by then to the messages that are receiving my inbox or my channels. A fourth tip or idea or possibility for you would be to plan for focus time for deep work. I usually even use my calendar as a tool to structure my tasks and my to-dos. This is something, of course, in some weeks it works better, in some weeks it works less good, but I do have my tasks in my calendar so that I really plan for the moment and plan for that deep work in my calendars. Also, if my calendar, for example, has a certain calendar item there, you're not able to book in any other meeting. But within a team, maybe we need to think about different possibilities on how to communicate, because if everybody has the calendar full with deep time, maybe we're not able to find a meeting time, and if there is a meeting necessary, that might be another challenge, right? But this is maybe a different topic where there are not thousands, but maybe at least 10 different ways on how to handle that in your team. Focus time is important, because otherwise you'll be frustrated sitting all day long in meetings, but not advancing your work. And when we talk about meetings, here I'm just going to give you a very quick fun statistics also that I just again read this week, because I was preparing for my hybrid meeting workshop. It is about from the Harvard University and Boston University that took a survey on managers, and we do know that 70% of managers believe that the meetings that they're in, hybrid or virtual, are unproductive and inefficient. And now think about that. 50% of their time, of managers' time, usually is in meetings. And this is when, of course, we need to ask ourselves, how much is a bad communication or bad meetings costing my organization? And with that, we do have a meeting calculator. So if you're interested, I'm really happy to share with you the link to a meeting cost calculator that was published online. And you can just drop me a note and I'm happy to share that. At the end, I do see here a comment. Thank you very much. Again, a great reminder about focus time. Absolutely. I do use that in my calendar, but as I said, I also not always do really stick to what I plan, but that's also the flexibility that we are looking for to some extent. And with that, again, thank you very much for joining. If there is still somebody who wants to join the stage, let me know in the comments now, and I'll bring you on board. You can let us know what is your perspective on asynchronous communication or communication in virtual teams in general or hybrid teams. Let me know and I'll bring you on board. If not, check out on virtualspacehero.com to know more about our upcoming LinkedIn live guests. And with that, I'm saying thank you very much. It was great for the first time indeed to be here alone on the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn live stage. You were fantastic. Also, thanks a lot for sending in the messages and for your comments. And well, let's go async as much as our team needs it. And with that, I'm leaving you and hoping you're having a beautiful morning, afternoon, or good night. Bye.